Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to have my guest today, Stephanie Cruz. She is the founder and CEO of the DigiGeeks Collective. I have known Steph for many years. I always find my conversations with her incredibly interesting. They often take turns that are unexpected, and I think that you're going to learn a lot from her today about her experience, her perspective, and the things that your organization can do to change how you approach social media. I'm a founding partner at Build, and these chats are just an opportunity for me to have conversations with leaders like Steph, who can use technology and have used technology as strategic levers for change. So this is not unknown to anyone, but social media has become a powerful tool where we can broadcast messages, we can organize around key ideas and mobilize people around a common cause. But a lot of nonprofits are also using social media to directly engage with constituents. From social media listening to monitoring and evaluation, tools like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter have evolved from being used just simply to do promotion to being used in much more personalized one-to-one interactions. Social media has obviously been in the news quite a bit recently, and the conversations about social media have been justifiably not always positive. But today I'm hoping we can shine a light on some of the ways social media has been used as a positive lever for change. My guest today, Steph, is the founder and CEO of DigiGeeks Collective. I'm going to ask Steph to share more about her experience in a bit because I think her story, in addition to her professional background, is incredibly interesting. The DigiGeeks Collective works on digital and social strategies, and I love this part. They talk about the mobilization of social movements. And I've worked with a bunch of folks that are part of the DigiGeeks Collective, and they are an amazingly talented group of individuals. Steph, thank you so much for being my guest today, and I appreciate you making time to chat.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm super excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. So we've known each other for a long time, I think for 5 years.
Yeah, 5
and
years.
if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask a little bit about your journey before starting DigiGeeks Collective. And I know you grew up in New York City, and your journey took you out west to Malibu and then all the way back east to DC. And hopefully you can tell your version of that story and give a little bit more context behind that story and how you came to be in DC and the journey that took you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just say that I'm playing with the sun, so I may have to shift my computer a few times as the sun is setting where I am. So I grew up in New York City, Upper West Side, really humble beginnings. My mom had me at 18. She was a single mom, and grew up really with this idea that education was what was going to make a difference in my life and help me change the quality of my life. So I went through school, kind of didn't have a choice, going to college, gonna move forward and make a difference. I applied to 10 colleges. I got into 9. University of Miami, I still hold a grudge for putting me on a wait list. And I got accepted to Pepperdine University, which is a very different, obviously, environment than growing up in New York City. Kyle knows this, I was told that as a young woman who came from poverty, woman of color, that Pepperdine, which is very affluent population, I wouldn't belong there, I wouldn't fit in. So my hard-headedness said, okay, I'm going to go there. So I went to Pepperdine University. It's a very conservative school and not necessarily aligned with my political leanings, but I've made the best friends of my life there. I was able to have conversations with people who thought completely differently than the way that I had grown up. And we wrestled and we talked through really difficult times. So that was really pivotal to my education. Through one of my professors there, I became interested in political science, really understanding sociology and juvenile delinquency and really understanding how my lived experience fit within a larger context of policy and what was happening in the world. And so that brought me out to DC, where I worked for Congressman Rangel from New York, who was my member of Congress. I still wanted to be very connected to the community that I came from. So I also ran a nonprofit for girls and young women of color in digital media. So I split my time on Capitol Hill and also ran this nonprofit. And that turned into working on Capitol Hill for 7 years. I ended up working for Congressman Sandy Levin of Michigan, who is someone that I really respect and admire. And I became his digital director way back in 2006.
I would
It's a
imagine.
little bit of my beginnings of my career in life.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing that story again. And I'm reminded, I had forgotten about all of the elements of that. And, just as a personal note, my wife had sort of a similar experience growing up. Her mom had her when she was 19, was a single mom, and went to college while she had her. And I just think it's an incredible story.
Yeah, it's a lived
Yeah.
experience that I feel like there was a day in one of my juvenile delinquency classes where they showed a video of a girl, she was about 8 or 9 years old, living in a homeless shelter in New York. And they were kind of showing like her lived experience and everything she was facing. And then at the end of the class, the professor and the students were like, the little girl says like, I want to go to college or something like that. And everyone in the class was like, oh, that's really nice. We know that that's not really going to happen. And I was able to stand and say like, I'm a statistic, right? I fall into all the statistics that we fall into this class. And you and I worked at America's Promise. There's like 10 risk factors that determine whether or not a young person is going to go to high school, graduate from high school, go on to college. And I fall into probably 90% of those risk factors. And here I am talking to you and the CEO of my own company, right? So like really pushing against some of these stereotypes. So Kyle, I've loved the time that I've worked with you, and I think you've really helped me to affirm and see the value that I bring to the work that I do. So again, excited for our conversation.
I am too. And I love it's such a great, just a little bit more about your story, and then we'll go on to some of the other questions. When you reminded me that the reason you went to Pepperdine was because people would tell you you wouldn't succeed, and you were like, well, then I'm definitely going. I was like, that is the Steph Cruz I know. I'm curious about your time on the Hill. You were, I'm guessing, doing digital strategy. Like I have never worked on the Hill, but it had to be very new. And I'm wondering what that looked like and how that impacted engaging with Congressman Levin's constituents, all of those things.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. It was 2006, so it was before Obama got elected, and everyone sort of understood that digital and social actually played a role in politics and in reaching people. So I remember going to a fundraising event and someone asked me, which I hate fundraising events, Capitol Hill. So I went, and one of the people that were there was like, "Oh, what do you do?" Because in DC, that's what people ask you. You're not like a human. And I said, I'm an online communications coordinator, because at that point, like we were like making up titles, right? Because this whole thing was super new. And he was like, "Oh, so you play on YouTube all day?" And I was like, no, like I am helping a member of Congress who works in DC connect to his constituents in Michigan. And I'm helping to create a bridge so that people understand and have transparency around what's happening in DC and the decisions that are being made that affect them. So it was very new. I was part of a committee that worked with Nancy Pelosi's office to help members of Congress understand why they needed a digital presence, why they should set up a Facebook page and a Twitter account. So I was really a part of sort of that inaugural class. And now I totally regret it. I think all political officials should get off of social media and really concerned about the way that, obviously we just went through, 4 years of a tweet kind of blowing up your day. And so have really thought about and continue to think about the role that digital and social play and how members of Congress and elected officials really engage with their constituents.
The other thing that I was hoping you could talk about, and I'm jumping around a little bit, is the Women's March on Washington in 2016
Mm-hmm.
and your involvement in the social and digital strategy for that. And I think on the homepage of the DigiGeeks Collective, there's a picture from that time. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, there is.
Yeah,
There
I'm
is.
I'm hoping you can just paint a picture of what that was like. And you told me around the time you were sort of in it, and it seemed like it was very high energy, fast paced, collaborative. I'm just curious if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what that experience was like and how you mobilized around that singular event.
Yeah, and if you let me share my screen, I can show the picture.
Do I have
So
to? Do I have to?
no, you don't. I think I can just share.
All right.
Okay, so this is the digigeeks.com. This is the collective, this amazing group of individuals that I work with. And this picture is actually from March for Our Lives, because I also helped with the digital and social for March for Our Lives in addition to the Women's March. And this shows you this amazing group of individuals that came together to really mobilize digital and social for this event. So I can share a little bit about my story with the Women's March. It was really an interesting experience. So the Women's March came to DC. That was sort of the main march. And then there were 800 marches around the country and the world. And about 3 days before the march, it was Wednesday at about 11 p.m., I got an email from someone that I knew that I worked with, and he asked me if I wanted to be a part of history. And it was literally, the subject was, do you want to be a part of history? And there was nothing in the email. And I was like, sure, I don't even know what that means. And then I got a call from four of the organizers of the Women's March, and they told me they needed someone to run digital and social. They were particularly concerned about security and the live feed being attacked and being brought down. So they really needed someone to focus on that. And so I was like, well, there's a lot of really talented people who do social and digital in DC. You should probably call them. And they were like, we just spoke to someone. The woman that they spoke to was named Mary. And apparently she yelled at them because they didn't have this together 3 days before the march. And Mary was like yelling about all the things that they needed. And having worked on Capitol Hill, having grown up the way that I did, chaos is like whatever, right? Like, we're going to organize it, we're going to make a way, we're going to make it through. And I told them we'll figure it out together. And so I agreed to help oversee digital and social. I came the next day on Thursday. I called in sick to work. Kyle, I think you know that. And I didn't tell anyone. And sort of I went to the hub where the organizers of the march were meeting, which was the Watergate Hotel. And it was sort of the basement of the Watergate. It was a fascinating experience to watch, 50, 60 people who have decided a month ago that they were going to do this march, and now there's 1 million people coming to DC. And during that time, I spent all of Thursday, half a day, just listening, getting a sense of, what was moving, what were the moving parts of the march, who was marching, who was speaking, what were security concerns. There were a lot of concerns around who's going to be on the ground. We didn't know, was someone going to show up with a bomb? Like, it was high intensity. It was a very politically charged time, right? So there was a lot of fear. And I spent that day listening, and I built out a digital communications plan. And while the team was really concerned about the live feed, I was really concerned about the people that were coming to this march, right? So you had people, women especially, coming from all over the country on planes. And I remember Southwest planes, I think they turned the lights pink. And I remember that. I thought that was awesome. You had women that were really upset that Hillary Clinton wasn't speaking at the march, but they were coming anyway. And you had Black and African American women, especially, and brown women, who didn't feel like they were being reflected in the march. And no one really knew all the details because it all came together really quickly.
Yeah.
And my thing was, how do we make sure that everyone feels valued and appreciated? How does everyone who comes to this event, how can we use digital and social to make sure that they feel connected? And so that was my number one goal. And so we had tons of people calling that wanted to volunteer, which was actually really hard, right? How do you organize volunteers? I found one volunteer who was a Facebook employee, and she told me she can get 10 of her colleagues at her apartment who could all help with social. And I was like, great. And so what I put them in charge of was listening for people who were coming to the march. So they were on social, watching the hashtag and thanking people for being there and answering their questions, which to me was number one priority. My next priority was how do we capture moments for this march and make sure that people can see them and engage them online. So I created a team of 6 people, all women, mostly women of color, and we focused on, listening. We were listening for any security concerns, there were many lost children who got disconnected from their parents, so we listened for that. I think my favorite story that I don't know that I told you, Kyle, is that a woman went into labor at the Native American Museum, and the crowds were so big that no one could, the ambulance couldn't reach her. And this is the power of social media, right? The American Indian Museum DM'd us through Twitter and was like, we have a pregnant woman like trying to get out. And so I was able to call command, who was able to open the way so that this ambulance can reach. And I was told when we were preparing, like, you're not going to be able to watch DMs and you're not going to be able to listen on the hashtag because there's going to be so much noise. But if we had chosen not to listen, we would have missed some really important moments, right, where we could be helpful. So my priorities, again, were people feeling seen, connected, and appreciated, and then really listening for any of those potential security concerns. We had the New York Times DM us. It was just, social actually became really critical to keeping a line of communication with the people that were there and the people that were at home who couldn't be there. So don't get me excited about talking about that.
No,
and it was in 3 days, right? Like, it created a plan, executed a plan, created a team. It was pretty crazy.
I mean, the things that I think the interesting thing about the story is that you started with listening and carried listening all the way through. Like, you started with, I'm just going to listen at the beginning to gain information. And then you carried listening all the way through to the experience of the people participating. And I can't help but think that the things you were talking about have applicability to a lot of the folks listening today, that even if they're not dealing with a singular event or a moment in time or a crisis or an emergency, that so many of the things you talked about are the foundation of a good social strategy.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's a place that a lot of people skip, right? Like, a lot of people focus on what information do I have to push out. So even this team is like pushing out their live stream, right? Like, that's the number one thing. But if we don't understand who our audience is, if we don't understand what they're looking for and how to best engage with them, it's kind of falling on deaf ears, right? You can put out all of the information you want, but does it meet your audience where they are? And for me, how people feel is really important, right? So do they feel heard? Do they feel valued? And personally, I think airlines do a really good job of this. I think you and I have talked about this before. And even like my local DMV is doing this now, where you can tweet like you're upset, right? Like, I missed my flight was late, or I'm trying to get an appointment at the DMV, I can't get through. And there are literally people on the other end who are listening to your concern and responding in real time. And they have really sophisticated backend where they're like tracking who you are and what you've complained about and how they can rectify the situation. But at the center of that is that they're listening. And so for me, listening is really powerful and central to social and digital strategy.
And you would know the stats, but I just think about the power of that listening with people who don't typically have access to have their voice shared, or in direct service, the accessibility to these platforms, and tweeting and things like that. It's not universally accessible to all communities, but it's much more accessible than people feeling like they can pick up a phone and advocate for themselves.
Yeah, and I think you also made me think about, we talk about social, but digital, right? The role that websites can play. And I think this was something when I was working for the congressman that was really important to me. when I was redoing their website, when we were working with the congressman, I went to Michigan and I met with the people who did direct service with constituents, and I listened. I said, what are the things that people call about the most? What are some of the biggest concerns? What are some of those top questions? And my thinking was, okay, I'm hearing this. How can people service themselves, right? How can we put that information on our website in a way that if I'm coming to your website at 2 a.m. and I have a problem with my social security or receiving my social security, I don't have to wait till the next day to get a call. I can initiate support in that moment. But part of understanding how to address those issues was listening to the staff and listening to what were the concerns that people were asking. So again, center audience, listen, and I think you can really narrow in on how to best meet the needs of, as you said, people who might not have access, right? Not everyone's on Twitter, not everyone's on Facebook. So I think the multi-platform approach is also really important.
And I think about those things informing, not just a digital strategy, but what are the questions people are asking? Are we creating the resources that people need? Like, we need a PDF that explains. A PDF's not the greatest example, but we need the content to support these types of questions, or we need the staffing to answer these questions. And we, using that example, I'd imagine you see peak questions about Social Security during certain times of the times of the month, and so it can inform all kinds of things if you're doing a good job of listening.
Yeah, it was funny because one of the vendors on the Hill stole my model. Like, I redid that section of the website, like constituent service, and they copied it and then they like sold it to other um, members of Congress, but they didn't change the content. So, so it was like, contact, your office in Michigan. But it was really interesting to see that this model that I had created based on listening was something that was being replicated by other offices, which was amazing, right? Like, the biggest sign of flattery is, being able to have people utilize the tools that you've created. So love that.
Yeah. Tell me about what led you. You said this earlier. You and I worked together at America's Promise Alliance, and from there, you always asked me questions about what it was like to be a consultant and how dreamy was it. And I tried to disavow that it was dreamy and that it was just this easy life. But you didn't listen, and you started your own company and became a consultant. I'm curious what led you to do that? And tell me more about, I know some of the people at DigiGeeks Collective. I know everyone you've ever introduced me to, even people that are not part of the DigiGeeks Collective. You seem to attract people who are passionate, thoughtful, super smart. Tell me about DigiGeeks Collective.
Yeah, I think at the point that I started DigiGeeks, I was the vice president of marketing and digital at America's Promise. I had done that for 4 years, focused on children and youth, which is really my passion area. And I loved the work that I did. And they got to a point that I was thinking about, how do I bring these strategies and these ideas and these experiences that I've had, how do I bring them to more organizations? How do I engage with more projects? Because the whole time that I worked on the Women's March, the March for Our Lives, I worked on the Families Belong Together immigration movement, I had a job, right? I had a full-time job, but these projects were lighting something up in me. Like, I light up when I talk about them. And so it was a question for me around, how do I create a world in which I can align the things that I'm passionate about, the causes that I'm passionate about, and then the work and the experience that I have. And after 4 years, I made that transition to leave America's Promise and start consulting on my own, actually, before I started the DigiGeeks Collective. And it was really interesting. I also needed a break. I used to work 60 to 70 hours a week, which Kyle knows. I think my last week at America's Promise, I literally worked 100 hours. And I don't know how that's physically possible, but I did. And I think that's also something people don't talk about, how much time and effort goes into this work, right? And so people think you just post on social media, or like that guy who told me in 2006 you play on YouTube. No, it's strategy. It's reaching people where they are, really engaging and creating content and making sure that it's being pushed out. And so I took a break. I took a step back. I engaged with one or two clients. I actually took 2 months off, which I think is not something you can really do when you have a full-time job. But as a consultant, I made that choice and made a choice to also create my schedule how I wanted it to be. And then after about a year of doing that, I started to pilot a model where I helped to bring together multiple consultants depending on the needs of the client, right? So I met one client and they said they needed, sorry, the lighting is terrible, Kyle.
No problem. You look angelic. Yeah, I think.
Okay. Oh, wait, I think
Oh,
I got
you got
it.
it.
Okay, I got it. So I transitioned to consulting, and then I had a client who needed someone to run day-to-day social media, and they also needed like engagement with partners and mobilizing partners to share content and create sort of a movement around a particular cause. And so I started to pilot this idea of, okay, I can, a lot of agencies say, yeah, I can do it, right? Like anything you ask them, they're like, yeah, video, sure. Social media, sure. Ads, yeah, I can do that. But in reality, they don't have all of the expertise in all of those areas, right? It's like, it's not possible. I can tell you I'm a digital strategist, but I don't know how to do everything. And so instead, I was piloting this model where I actually pull experts together. So if a client tells me they will need to do ads and day-to-day social, I pull people who are specialists and experts in those areas, and we form a team for that particular project. And I ended up piloting this with about 3 to 4 clients in the last quarter, fourth quarter of 2020. And it worked really good. It was fun, and clients seemed to be pleased. And so in March of this past year, I officially launched DigiGeeks with 11 other colleagues who are also either consultants or work full time and do consulting work in digital and social, and actually traditional comms as well. And this is what we do. We actually, some people call us like the Avengers. So we form teams based on what the client needs. And so some of my clients, there's 5 of us. On some clients, there's 2 of us. And I'm not on every client because I don't always have the expertise that client is looking for. But what it allows us to do is align our values, our interests, the needs of the client, and to be really honest about what we can bring. And just form these amazing teams. And it's been insanely gratifying. I love it. I love the people I work with. I love the clients I work with. It gives me a significant amount of flexibility, which I really enjoy. And you played a pivotal role in showing me that consulting was a thing, and not just consulting, but creating a safe space for consultants to work together. It's a lonely space sometimes when you're doing consulting alone on your own and freelancing. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done. We've been working together for about 7 months now. And we love the clients that we work with, and it's really exciting.
Yeah. It's so fun to listen to you talk about this because it's really an articulation of things that you've been talking about for years. And I'm so impressed that you pulled all this together because I know that it takes a lot of work. And I hope you're not working 100-hour weeks.
I'm not. I was in Puerto Rico this weekend. Yeah, no. And sometimes I am, right? It depends on the needs of the client. But when I was working internally, it was every week. It was my day-to-day. And now I can kind of flex and lean in when I need to, and I can take a step back when I need to as well, which I think is really important for people who work in communications and digital and social, because social doesn't stop, right? Like I've worked in political comms, and if something happens online and you miss it and you don't respond in real time, like you're in trouble, right? Like if you post something and then people respond in a really negative way and you miss it, you're in trouble. So there's a sense of like responsibility and kind of 24/7 approach to this work that's really unhealthy. So I think really being able to create some of those boundaries and some structures around what's realistic and what's healthy for yourself and for the organization is really important too.
It's interesting you say that because I oftentimes, when I encounter organizations in their marketing communications function, it seems as though not all of them do a good job of understanding that they're not a late breaking news organization, that people aren't truly looking for them to be responding to every single thing in the moment, and that it doesn't mean you shouldn't respond, but it doesn't have to be in the moment. And but if the belief is it needs to be in the moment, it sort of creates that dynamic you're talking about, right? Rather than a, hey, this event does directly impact our constituents or directly impact our mission. We can take 2 or 3 days to think about what our response is going to be. People aren't looking to us to lead the response on this by
Oh
and
no,
large.
everything's on fire all the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
Kyle. All the time.
When you told the story earlier about the client where they asked you to come in and run day-to-day digital, I would imagine that's oftentimes where people start. How did you create space, or how did you build awareness with them that you can do that, but it really needs, ultimately where you need to go is to a place of listening, and that has to be informed by conversations, and that's going to be an evolution. Without talking about the specifics of that client, can you talk a little bit about how you get people to think about that we can keep the trains running, but we may be running the wrong trains at the wrong schedule?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question because the entry point that I get with a lot of clients is because people know me for digital and social is, my social media is not right. Like I'm not getting the growth that I want. I'm not getting the engagement. And then that's sort of the entry point to a conversation as you described. And one of the initial things I always do is a discovery conversation to really understand what are the goals of your organization, what are the strategies that you're engaging from a larger communications level, and then social as a tactic, how is it supporting those goals? And I often find there's no articulated strategy at the top, or they're not very clear goals and strategies from a communications perspective. There's not clarity around who the audience is. And so it sort of scaffolds, right? And so while we start, to me, the social engagement is actually here, right? But there's all this work that needs to happen before so that it makes sense, as you were describing. And through a natural progression of conversation, we actually realize that we have significant amount of work to do at the top. And that once we answer some of those critical conversations that align with the goals of the organization, what they're trying to do, how social and digital support those goals and will advance them, then we can really get to a content calendar and really think about what that content schedule is and how we listen and engage with the people that are engaging with our organization. So very often that is the progression of the work that I do. So while we come in at a day-to-day engagement, we tend to very quickly go and shift to a strategic conversation, which I think is really important to have clear before you're thinking about your day-to-day execution.
What when you engage in those conversations, what role does data play in that conversation? Is it something that comes after those conversations? Does it inform those conversations? Typically, how do you approach? Because I assume you have access to a lot of data about what people are talking about and what the relevancy of certain phrases are, those sorts of things. So I'm curious when you bring data into the conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting and actually a huge concern of mine how much the nonprofit sector doesn't make data-driven decisions when it comes to social and digital. And so what I often find is that no one's actually tracking data and analytics. And so one of the things we initially have to do is create a baseline and really understand, you often have a CEO or leader that's like, we're not getting engagement. We're not, well, what does engagement mean? What are those numbers? What are those metrics that we are measuring ourselves up against? Because our goal is not necessarily to measure up against this other organization that has 1 million people who are their members. Our goal is to understand where are we in our baseline, and then based on that baseline, create some goals around those. So it's a huge concern and pet peeve for me how much folks are not following the data, right? And I work with this amazing data analytics firm, Zoom, who I love. And one of the things that they do They do amazing listening. They do really audience analysis, really helping you to understand who your audience is, what they're talking about, and how you can be strategic about engaging them. Another thing that they do that a number of companies do is tracking hashtags, right? So not only am I tracking my own Twitter account and how many people are engaging with my account, I've launched a conversation, right? Let's say our conversation is build consulting, right? And it's hashtag build consulting. And we're talking about the importance of strategy when we're thinking about technology. But who's talking about that? How often are people talking about that? You know, what other things are they talking about while they're also talking about hashtag build consulting? That is not a metric or content that people really follow. And companies like Zoom and others help you to create, you know, systems to listen for those conversations. So for example, for the March for Our Lives, I was able to set up, you know, this listening. And if you don't do it before, you can't retroactively get the data. You have to set it up before you launch a conversation. And when you track these conversations, you know, I think when we were at America's Promise, we had hashtag Grad Nation. By the end of the year, we saw that 49,000 people had used that hashtag because we were tracking the data, and we were able to see who those people were, where did they live, you know, what generation did they belong to, what other things that were they interested in, what kind of professions were they were from. And that really helps you to understand what type of content to serve them, right? What type of things, this is part of the listening, right? But it's listening from a data perspective as well. But there are tools that need to be purchased and put in place in order to do this effectively. And really looking at your own platforms and what those metrics are so that you can create baselines for yourself and measure yourself, not you know, I have 53,000 followers and ARP has a million, whatever. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is who are those 53,000? What are they interested in? And then what is a growth that's realistic for your organization? And what are you willing to do to invest to grow that audience and really bring value to that audience? So super like passionate about data-driven decisions and very concerned about the lack of use of data in digital and social in the nonprofit sector. If you could see from my voice,
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
really concerned.
well, where I go is the applicability of that data. And I talked about this earlier. You know, if it was a strategy to engage rural communities, understanding to what extent are people in rural communities engaging with your organization, that can be a metric that while it has, I assume while it has benefit to tracking digital and social engagement, it also is sort of a barometer or thermometer. How much do people in these communities that we want to serve, how much are they actively engaging with us?
And what are they talking about? What do
Yeah.
they care about? What are the demographics? You know, are they two-parent homes? What do they earn? What's most important to them? And which platforms are they on? Right? 53,000 people on Facebook and 53,000 on Twitter doesn't mean the same because the audiences are different and the people who are engaging might be different. And maybe you have 20,000 people on TikTok and that is a completely different audience, right?
Yeah.
So I completely and totally agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. This is why I like these conversations, because you agree with everything that I say.
Okay.
I don't bring people to the fireside chat who's going to disagree with me, Steph.
Okay. Well, then I'm about to disagree. Give me another question. I'm gonna make sure I disagree.
Well, it's a question, you know, and as I've been listening to you and thinking about the clients that I've worked with, I have this hypothesis that smaller organizations in some ways tend to do social better, even if the even if they have the same skill sets, because the smaller organizations are more invested and closer to that listening than larger organizations who may move into more of a promotional mindset. Do you think that's a fair stereotype, or is this an opportunity for you to disagree with me?
It's perfect. Perfect opportunity for me to disagree with
Oh,
you.
damn.
Thank you for opening the window.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I actually think smaller organizations tend to be very poorly resourced from a staffing perspective. So you tend to have one person who's running comms, and that person who's running comms is responsible for traditional press outreach, website, social media, graphics, video, and it's kind of set up to a point where people don't have the time to listen. They don't have
Mhm.
the time to be strategic because they're being reactive. They're also responsible for I think a very unrealistic um, number of things, that the things that I all described, right? There's writing, there's content, there's press outreach, there's how press engages with social now, right? There's listening, there's multimedia, video, and graphics. Those are different people. Those are different skill sets. And so if you have one person doing all of those things, their ability to really strategically, and then email, we didn't even talk about email marketing. Um, to be strategic, to be thoughtful, to really advance your strategic goals, it's almost impossible, right? There's some unicorns that can do it, but it's really unfair. This is why we work 60, 70 hours. And so, when I worked at America's Promise, I came in and I was, I had one FTE. I had one person who's Sarah Boyson, who is someone I adore and love and think she's an amazing digital strategist. But it was unrealistic for us to tackle all of those different pieces by ourselves. So over time, we were able to bring in a digital specialist. We were able to bring in someone who focused on, design and video, and worked with my colleagues that did traditional media and writing and blogs. And I think from a nonprofit sector, from a smaller organization, there's a lack of appreciation and understanding on what all these pieces are, and the fact that you actually need to resource them well to be strategic and thoughtful. So I actually really worry about smaller organizations. I also advise a lot of founders of small initiatives and social justice movements, and a lot of times they have volunteers that are doing this work. They're doing it themselves, right, from their phones, and they're insanely successful. They can set things up, but it's not meeting the bigger goals. It's not advancing. It's not setting them up for long-term success. And so I feel like it's kind of scattershot, and it's not their fault because they don't understand or they don't know or appreciate what is a really successful team. And so something that I think, and I worked at AARP, and I work with Jen Lee Reeves, who's she's one of our DigiGeeks, a social media trainer. And one of the things that was super successful about their social strategies, they had a team of like 10 people, right? And so they were thinking about voice and audience and content that was aligned with what the members of AARP were looking for. But I think that resourcing is actually an advantage, right? You look at the airline industry, their resource. What does Wendy's social media team look like? Right? Like Wendy's kicks butt on social. How many staffers do they have as part of that team? I think we take for granted there's not an intern on the other end or volunteer. No, right? Really?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not, right? There's not one person who's doing all of these different pieces. And I think this is really a thing where we don't resource this area well, and I actually worry a lot about smaller organizations.
I told you I'd give you something to disagree with me about.
I love it. Thank you.
I think that hearing all of that, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that both of our firms, and this isn't a plug for both of our firms, that's why people bring us in, because you can't bring in a single person who does all of those things. And I think, you were talking about smaller organizations, and I think I've shared this story with you. I was at a Salesforce conference maybe 5 years ago, and I don't remember the higher education institution, but they were incredibly well resourced, especially around the time that new students were being admitted. And they were listening to parents saying, oh my gosh, my daughter's heading off to Pepperdine. I don't know what it's going to be like to not have her around. And they were responding to parents. They saw their parents as part of their constituency in terms of listening to those folks. But they probably had 4 or 5 people doing that, to your point.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the solution for all small nonprofits is to hire 4 or 5 people.
I think they could do 2 to 3. I think
Yeah.
you need a senior director, someone who is a strategist, someone who has a seat at the table with the CEO or seniors or senior executives in the organization. Whatever that is, it's someone who can kind of be watching things and making decisions at a high level. And then I think you can get away with splitting someone who's running social content, who's writing, who's thinking about content strategy, and then someone who's doing digital media, right? So, posts that have video and graphics and photos, So they perform better than just text. So and these things are time consuming. But I think to your point in terms of like our agencies and not wanting to plug, but we are often seen as a bench, right? We're like we're like who you call to add surge capacity to your organization. So maybe you have two comms people or one comms person, but you have a huge event coming up, or you have a campaign that you're launching. So part of what we do is do an assessment of, okay, you're missing a person who can do X, Y, and Z. Let me source those folks that are consultants, that are DigiGeeks, that are DigiGeeks partners, and bring them into this fold. And what I really enjoy that I didn't mention about DigiGeeks, we don't do long-term contracts. So most of our contracts are 3 to 6 months. And the idea is that we are really coming in to provide that surge capacity to build your capacity also, right? So if your comms person needs training around social media or needs training around writing or any of those things, we want to help set you up so that you can continue this work without us, right? Yeah. So we're not trying to set you up so that you are reliant on us and we're always the bench that you call. And we advise around staffing, right? What is that staffing model? In some places you can get away with 3 people. In some places you really need 10 people. And very rarely are people willing to admit that they need that much help, or that, advocating for increasing resources in this space is not easy. But a lot of times when, we've hired 5 consultants and you see the difference of the output of really having experts in each of these areas and supporting your staff, we do find that we can help shift and mold how organizations think about staffing. We've had that experience.
So for our listeners today, if they were listening to this and their thought is next fiscal year, I need to increase my headcount. I hear what Steph is saying. What are the things that they can do between now and the time they can increase headcount? What can they do to evolve or move away from just being promotional? What are the things that you would say that somebody can do as a small step?
I think one thing is that data, right? Like pull the data that you can. Let's say you can't buy one of the fancy tools. Facebook provides data, Twitter provides data, Google Analytics on your website. Pull that information. Get a better understanding of who's in your audience, and who are you talking to. And then really based on that information, based on what your goals are for the year, for the next 6 months, what you're trying to accomplish, really try to match up who you're talking to and what your goals are. And then listen. Go on Twitter. What are they talking about? What's important to them, right? What are the pieces of content they've posted on Facebook that really get people engaged, where you get more people posting and commenting? Listen and engage. So I would say data, listening, and then think about a strategy, right? Take half a day to bring your team together, executive team, everyone together. Everyone plays a role in social and digital. Everyone sources content. Come together and decide, what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? What's most important based on what we've learned from listening and data? And then create a social media plan and a content calendar. But I think these are steps that are missed that I don't know most folks take. And I think they're crucial to really building true and quality engagement online.
It's interesting. Maybe there's another point for you to disagree with, is that, oftentimes my work brings me to looking at technology like constituent relationship management or digital marketing platforms, but invariably what gets exposed in sort of, as we begin to think about what that might look like, is my experience is that a lot of organizations don't know who their audiences are, or if it's 8 executives, I would get 8 different answers about who those audiences are. Are you nodding because you're getting ready to disagree with me, or nodding because you think that's right?
I think that's right. And that's why the data is so important, because you can go to X executive who, this is part of managing up too. yes, I know that you think that our audience are like males between 45 and 50, but actually the data shows us that there's 75% women and that they're between the ages of 25 and 35. And you can't argue with the data, right? And so, yes, I completely agree. And I think from previous experience with organizations that I've worked with and clients, it's so powerful when you have the data and people listen. I think you can really help to shift strategy and really get organizational buy-in on strategic goals and approaches to this work when you have clear data around audience. So I completely agree with you. See, I didn't disagree, Kyle.
Yeah, and that seems like a perfect place to end today's fireside chat on a high note. I I really, really appreciate you making time. I feel like I could have gone for another hour, but I want to be respectful of your time. And if folks want to find you between the hours of 9 and 4, Monday through Friday, what's a good way to get in touch with you?
10 to 6 actually
10,
would
that's
be
right.
my
I forgot you. I forgot you were
no,
never in the office before 10, and you were there. You
never.
were one of the last people to leave. I forgot.
Yeah,
10 to
yeah, yeah,
6.
yeah.
Okay.
Definitely don't take calls or meetings before 10. This is one of the joys of creating my own schedule. So I'm on Twitter at Stephanie Cruz, and it's STEF as in Frank, ANIECRUZ. I'm also on LinkedIn, and my email address is stephanie@digigeeks.com. And I can be reached any one of those ways. And I'm always, always happy to have a strategic conversation around the needs of an organization that's not about sales or trying to secure a client, but I really think it's important to match the skills of either a consultant or an organization or an agency with the needs of the client. And I'm always happy to advise on this for anyone. So open for conversation and calls or anything like that.
Yeah, I remember you and I talked about this. That there's 3 things that people should look for in a professional services firm. It's, can you solve my problem? Have you seen something like this before? And am I going to enjoy working with you? And how important that last thing is for you both ways, and how important that conversation is are we going to enjoy working together? And so I can see how that conversation is incredibly important to you.
Yeah, and joy is at the center of DigiGeeks work. It's actually it's one of our values. If we're not enjoying our work, we don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And so that is definitely super important.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Thank you,
again.
Kyle.
Yeah, it was so nice seeing you. Nice job working with the sun. I think unfortunately in
I think it's gone down.
another few days after this weekend, it will be dark at this time on the East Coast. So I really appreciate you making time, Steph.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Yeah. And you and I will get to talk together soon, even if it's not at a fireside chat.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.